April 1945, Central Berlin. Of the 7,000 to 8,000 men who entered the battle as the 11th SS Nordland Division, Danes, Norwegians, Dutch, and other foreign volunteers, only 300 to 500 would survive. This was not a tactical defeat, but total annihilation, a 90% casualty rate defending rubble with empty rifles while the Red Army closed in on Hitler's bunker. This is the story of the final collapse. By April 1945, Berlin was dying. The Red Army had encircled Hitler's capital in a steel vise. Marshals Zhukov and Konev commanded overwhelming Soviet forces that subjected the city to merciless artillery bombardment. The shells fell day and night. Buildings collapsed. Streets became craters. Entire blocks vanished under the bombardment. The once mighty Wehrmacht had disintegrated. In its place, defending the smoking ruins of the Reich Chancellery and the Führer bunker itself, stood something remarkable and tragic. The 11th SS Nordland Division, composed primarily of foreign volunteers from Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands. These weren't German troops. They were Scandinavian idealists, Dutch believers in a pan-Germanic crusade, men who had traveled from across occupied Europe to fight for Hitler's vision. The 3rd Germanic SS Panzer Corps, originally formed from volunteers across Germanic countries, had been pushed back from the Baltics through catastrophic retreats. Now, stationed in Berlin's central and southern sectors, the Nordland Division formed the backbone of the capital's southeastern defenses, the last organized SS formation standing between Soviet tanks and Hitler's bunker. But calling them organized was generous. The division that took up positions in late April bore little resemblance to a military unit. Approximately 7,000 to 8,000 men entered the battle, a composite force hastily integrated with remnants of the Hitler Youth, elderly Volkssturm militia clutching antiquated rifles, and ad hoc Wehrmacht units scraped together from retreating fragments. A Danish volunteer would later write, "I saw men I had trained with fall in the streets we once marched through." The strategic situation was beyond hopeless. It was mathematically impossible. Soviet numerical superiority was crushing. Their artillery turned entire city blocks into moonscapes. The Nordland Division had fewer than 10 serviceable armored vehicles when the battle began. Most tanks sat immobilized, transformed into static firing positions because fuel had simply run out. Ammunition was rationed to a few dozen rounds per rifle. Operational rates for both tanks and assault guns had collapsed below 50%. Yet SS Brigade Führer Gustav Krukenberg, commanding the division, had received Hitler's explicit orders: no retreat, no surrender, fight to the last man. In his post-war testimony, Krukenberg would admit the terrible truth. The situation was hopeless, but the orders were unequivocal. But the Nordland Division was already defeated before the first shot was fired. Not by Soviet tanks, but by something far more insidious: the complete collapse of their supply lines. Across Berlin's southeastern sector, dozens of Panzer IV tanks sat motionless in the rubble. Not because their crews had chosen static defensive positions, because there wasn't a single liter of fuel to move them. These 75mm guns, once the backbone of mobile armored warfare, had been reduced to concrete bunkers. Their crews would fight from these steel coffins until the last shell, then abandon them to the advancing Soviets. This was the reality facing the Nordland Division in April 1945. They were already defeated by logistics before a single Soviet soldier appeared in their sights. The numbers tell the story of systematic starvation. Frontline SS troops entered battle with ammunition restricted to a few dozen rounds per rifle, barely enough for a single sustained firefight. Artillery units, once capable of devastating barrages, now rationed their shells to handfuls per gun. Of the armored vehicles that had survived the retreat into Berlin, fewer than 10 remained serviceable at the battle's start. Operational rates for both vehicles and heavy weapons had collapsed below 50%. They would only decline further. The Soviet encirclement in mid-April had severed every external supply line. No convoys would break through. No Luftwaffe transports would land. The defenders were forced to scavenge ammunition from destroyed vehicles and abandoned positions, picking through the wreckage of their own defeated units like vultures. Food rations dwindled to starvation levels. Medical supplies vanished entirely. Wounded soldiers lay in cellars with no morphine, no bandages, no hope of evacuation. A Danish volunteer would later recall the desperate reality. "We fought not for victory, but for survival. I saw men I had trained with fall in the streets we once marched through. They shared what meager rations remained with Berlin's civilians, themselves silent and haunted by what they had seen." This wasn't tactical flexibility. This was the complete disintegration of military capability. Tank crews fought from immobile steel boxes. Infantry advanced with single magazines. Artillery fell silent for lack of shells. The Nordland Division had become a force that could only die in place, incapable of maneuver, reinforcement, or even basic resupply. The smell of burning buildings mixed with unwashed bodies and untreated wounds. Men went days without sleep. Their uniforms were caked with brick dust and dried blood. Some had holes in their boots. They could feel the cold concrete through the worn soles. And yet, from the Führer bunker beneath the burning city, the orders remained unequivocal. No retreat, no surrender. Fight to the last man. In the ruins of Berlin's government quarter, SS Brigade Führer Gustav Krukenberg stood among the rubble when the courier arrived from the Führer bunker. The message was brief, unambiguous. No retreat permitted. No surrender authorized. Fight to the last man. Krukenberg was to defend the Reich Chancellery and Führer bunker at all costs, delaying Soviet capture long enough for whatever desperate escape plans remained in Hitler's collapsing inner circle. What the courier couldn't deliver was what Krukenberg admitted in his post-war testimony. The situation was hopeless, but the orders were unequivocal. No surrender. Fight to the last. Still, many officers questioned the sense of further sacrifice in private. This was the fundamental contradiction of the Nordland Division's final days. Publicly, fanatical obedience. Privately, the crushing awareness of futility. The internal communications of the 3rd SS Panzer Corps tell the story Hitler never heard. Multiple officers urged Krukenberg to attempt a breakout, to negotiate capitulation, to spare the men from certain annihilation. One surviving letter from an SS officer, dated April 25th, captures the desperation. "We are surrounded. The Russians are everywhere. Many of us doubt the purpose of continued resistance, but orders are orders." But Krukenberg insisted on following Hitler's directives. Not because he believed in victory, his own testimony makes clear he recognized the hopelessness, but because of something more complex. "I felt a profound responsibility for the lives of my men," he later stated, "but the circumstances left little choice." It's a tragic paradox. The commander who felt responsible for his men's lives was the same man who followed orders guaranteeing their deaths. Krukenberg would reportedly rally the Nordland Division with words that captured this doomed sense of duty. "Gentlemen, we are going to die here, but we will do so with honor." He would later personally lead a small group in a desperate nighttime breakout attempt, guiding them through Soviet lines, an act that demonstrated both the hopelessness of their position and his refusal to simply wait for the end. The air in the command cellar was thick with cigarette smoke, and the acrid smell of explosives seeping through cracks in the concrete. Maps spread across makeshift tables showed Soviet positions closing like a noose. Officers spoke in hushed tones, their faces hollow in the candlelight. But Krukenberg was not commanding professional German soldiers. He led foreign volunteers, men who had traveled from Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and across Germanic Europe to fight for a regime that was now sending them to certain death in the ruins of a city most had never called home. The men defending these ruins weren't German. At least, most of them weren't. The Nordland Division, the core of Berlin's southeastern defense, was composed of the 23rd SS Panzergrenadier Regiment Norge, recruited from Norway, the 24th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment Denmark from Denmark, plus Dutch, French, Swiss, and Flemish contingents drawn from across occupied Europe. These were volunteers who had traveled hundreds or thousands of miles from their homes to fight for Hitler's vision of a unified Germanic Europe. Now they stood in the rubble of a German city most had never seen before. April 1945, ordered to die defending a bunker where a Führer they'd likely never met was planning his own suicide. Their motivations were as varied as their languages. Some had enlisted out of genuine ideological commitment to National Socialism, believing in the crusade against Bolshevism. Others had been effectively conscripted as Germany's grip on occupied territories tightened and voluntary recruitment became increasingly coercive. Still others, particularly among the younger recruits, had sought adventure, military glory, or simply escape from the grinding poverty and boredom of occupation. By April 1945, those motivations meant nothing. The ideologically committed, the reluctant conscripts, and the adventure seekers would all die the same way. The division that entered the Battle of Berlin numbered approximately 7,000 to 8,000 men, one of the last substantial SS formations still capable of organized resistance. But substantial was relative. These weren't the elite forces of 1940. They were exhausted survivors of the retreat from the Eastern Front, integrated with teenage Hitler youth, elderly Volkssturm militia, and whatever stragglers could be scraped together. A Danish volunteer would later capture the reality in his post-war memoir. The buildings were burning, the wounded lay everywhere. We fought not for victory, but for survival. I saw men I had trained with fall in the streets we once marched through. The streets they'd once marched through in triumph during training exercises and propaganda parades. Now they were dying in them, one rubble-choked block at a time. Some spoke Danish, others Norwegian, Dutch, French, German. They shouted orders in different languages. They wrote final letters home in different alphabets. A Norwegian soldier might die next to a Flemish volunteer, neither understanding the other's last words. These foreign volunteers would soon discover that their diverse languages and cultures meant nothing in the face of Soviet artillery and the brutal mathematics of urban warfare. The Red Army opened the final assault on Berlin with a bombardment that defied comprehension. Soviet artillery forces poured shells into the city at a rate that turned entire districts to rubble in hours. The ground shook continuously. Buildings collapsed in clouds of brick dust. The sound was deafening, a constant roar that made men's ears bleed. Across the lines, Nordland Division soldiers clutched rifles with perhaps 24 rounds each. The few dozen rounds per rifle that logistics had promised never arrived. Berlin was cut off, the supply chain severed. Artillery crews counted their remaining shells on one hand. This wasn't a battle, it was arithmetic. Marshals Zhukov and Konev commanded this overwhelming force with brutal efficiency. Their armies didn't just outnumber the defenders, they obliterated the very concept of numerical parity. Hundreds of T-34 tanks rumbled through Berlin's streets, supported by waves of aircraft that faced no Luftwaffe opposition. Soviet intelligence had done its work well. NKVD and SMERSH operatives had infiltrated the city, intercepted German radio traffic, and mapped defensive positions. The defenders were fighting blind against an enemy that could see everything. The Wehrmacht had ceased to exist as a coherent force. What remained were fragments, exhausted men from shattered divisions, Hitler youth barely old enough to shave, Volkssturm grandfathers with First World War rifles. Morale wasn't low, it was absent. The only thing holding these disparate units together was the Nordland Division's core of foreign volunteers, still maintaining something resembling military discipline amid the chaos. But discipline couldn't manufacture ammunition, training couldn't conjure fuel, and courage, however genuine, couldn't stop Soviet tanks. The Red Army pressed into the city center with methodical violence. House-to-house fighting erupted as Soviet infantry cleared each building, each cellar, each rubble pile. The Nordland defenders fell back toward their assigned sectors near the Reichstag and Brandenburg Gate, the government quarter they'd been ordered to hold at all costs. Behind them lay the Reich Chancellery. Below that, the Führerbunker. Ahead, an endless tide of Soviet steel. Soviet soldiers moved in coordinated teams. Flamethrowers cleared cellars. Satchel charges brought down walls. They had ammunition to spare. They had reinforcements. They had time. The Nordland Division had none of these things. As Soviet tanks rumbled through Berlin's streets, the Nordland defenders retreated into the rubble, preparing for the kind of desperate combat that would define their final hours. The close-quarter savagery, where their few remaining bullets might actually matter, where the Red Army's overwhelming superiority would be compressed into the width of a shattered doorway. Their crews would fight from these steel coffins until the last shell, then abandon them to the advancing Soviets. This wasn't metaphor, it was tactical reality. As the Nordland Division made its final stand near the Reichstag and Brandenburg Gate, SS tank crews used their immobilized Panzer IVs and Stugge 3s as fortified firing positions, their 75mm guns traversing across rubble-choked streets until ammunition ran out. Then they climbed out, grabbed whatever infantry weapons remained, and continued fighting on foot. The steel that had once symbolized German armored superiority became nothing more than temporary cover in a battle already lost. The government quarter became a killing ground measured in meters. Soviet T-34s pushed through Berlin's shattered avenues, but in the compressed horror of house-to-house combat, the Nordland defenders found one weapon that still mattered: the Panzerfaust. This disposable anti-tank weapon proved effective against Soviet armor at ranges up to 60 meters, close enough to see the rivets on a T-34's turret before pulling the trigger. In narrow streets where Soviet numerical superiority meant less, a single soldier with a Panzerfaust could knock out a tank, briefly stalling the advance. But briefly was the operative word. There were never enough Panzerfausts, never enough ammunition, never enough of anything. The supply chain hadn't just collapsed, it had ceased to exist. Defenders scavenged ammunition from abandoned positions, pried magazines from dead comrades, stripped rounds from destroyed vehicles. A Norwegian volunteer later recalled fighting with exactly 7 bullets, counting each shot, knowing the 8th would have to come from somewhere else, or wouldn't come at all. Artillery crews fired their last shells and became infantry. Machine gunners rationed bursts to 3-round increments. The fighting moved room to room. Soldiers kicked down doors. They threw grenades into cellars. They fought with bayonets when bullets ran out. The smell of cordite mixed with the stench of bodies that couldn't be retrieved. Brick dust coated everything. Men coughed blood from breathing the air. The Nordland Division wasn't fighting a battle. It was presiding over its own systematic dismantling. Yet Krukenberg's orders remained unchanged. Hold the Reich Chancellery sector, no retreat, fight to the last man. And so they did, block by block, building by building, room by room. The Reichstag loomed nearby, its damaged dome a monument to a government that no longer existed. The Brandenburg Gate stood silent witness to foreign volunteers dying for a German capital most had never seen before, April 1945. But as ammunition dwindled to single rounds and Soviet forces tightened their grip, even the most fanatical orders could not overcome the reality that the Nordland Division was being systematically erased. In a cellar beneath the Potsdamer Platz, the division's chaplain conducted services by candlelight while Soviet shells hammered the streets above. It was a surreal tableau. Prayers for the dying spoken over men who knew they'd be corpses within hours, absolution offered in a concrete tomb as the city burned overhead. This was the spiritual last rite of the Nordland Division, foreign volunteers seeking God's mercy for a regime that had abandoned both. But in those cellars, away from Krukenberg's rallying speeches and the fanatical pronouncements echoing from the Führerbunker, the private voices told a different story. An SS officer's letter, dated April 25, 1945, captured the internal collapse. "We are surrounded. The Russians are everywhere. Many of us doubt the purpose of continued resistance, but orders are orders." The phrasing is telling. Doubt acknowledged, then immediately suppressed by obedience. These weren't the ideological fanatics of propaganda. They were exhausted men who'd watched their ammunition vanish, their tanks immobilized, their comrades killed for streets that would be lost by morning. A Norwegian volunteer described the final hours with brutal honesty. "We waited for the end in the cellars. Above us, the city burned. We had no illusions, only the hope that our families would one day know we fought bravely. Not glory, not victory, just the desperate wish that someone, somewhere, would remember they'd tried." Even Berlin's civilians recognized the transformation. One survivor recalled, "The SS men were desperate and exhausted. Some shared their meager rations with us. Others were silent, haunted by what they had seen." These weren't the conquering legions who'd marched east in 1941. They were hollow-eyed soldiers rationing the last of their bread, sharing it with the very civilians they were supposed to be protecting, knowing both donor and recipient would likely be dead within days. The chaplain moved between cellars, offering what comfort theology could provide to Danes, Norwegians, Dutch, and Germans alike. A multinational congregation united only by imminent annihilation. He spoke in German, but many didn't understand. He made the sign of the cross over men who'd forgotten how to pray. His vestments were filthy. His hands shook. It was perhaps the most honest moment in the Nordland Division's existence. Stripped of ideology, reduced to human fear and the ancient rituals humans perform when facing death. Despite these private doubts, the orders remained unchanged. Fight to the last man. And as April drew to a close, that command would be fulfilled with horrifying literalness. Even as the chaplain's prayers echoed in the cellars, Nazi radio broadcasts told a very different story. Goebbels' propaganda machine proclaimed the Nordland Division's heroic, fanatical resistance, foreign volunteers choosing death over dishonor, fighting to the last man for Germanic Europe. But the reality in Berlin's rubble contradicted every word. While loudspeakers blared tales of SS valor, small groups of defenders were attempting desperate nighttime escapes through Soviet lines, preferring the risk of bullets to certain annihilation. The myth of monolithic SS fanaticism crumbles under historical scrutiny. Yes, some foreign volunteers, particularly the Scandinavian and Dutch contingents, demonstrated notable tenacity, their ideological commitment sustaining them through impossible conditions. But many others were simply trying to survive. Post-war records reveal numerous attempted desertions, surrenders, and breakouts that propaganda conveniently ignored. A Danish volunteer's memoir captures this contradiction. Some men fought with grim determination. Others whispered about escape routes and debated surrender in hushed conversations between bombardments. Nationality mattered enormously. Several foreign volunteers attempted to leverage their non-German status, hoping Western Allied forces might offer better treatment than Soviet captors promised. The Dutch and French contingents, some already disillusioned, saw their foreign passports as potential lifelines, a way to claim they'd been coerced, misled, swept up in ideology they now renounced. The desperation was palpable. Men who'd volunteered for the SS now frantically tried to separate themselves from German command, hoping their birthplace might save them from Soviet revenge. The commitment varied wildly, even within the same unit. While Krukenberg rallied men with speeches about dying with honor, his own officers privately urged breakout attempts. Some SS men shared their last rations with Berlin civilians. Others hoarded supplies and planned solo escapes. The monolithic image of SS fanaticism, every man a true believer fighting to his last breath, was propaganda, not reality. Human survival instinct competed with ideological orders. In those final days, survival often won. Men removed their SS insignia. They buried their identity papers. They memorized cover stories. A Norwegian volunteer practiced saying he'd been captured and forced to fight. A Danish soldier hid civilian clothes in his pack. A Dutch volunteer wrote 2 letters, one for his family if he survived, one if he died. Yet for most of the Nordland Division, there would be no escape. The mathematics of encirclement made that clear. Soviet forces surrounded Berlin in concentric rings, their numerical superiority absolute. The few hundred meters between German positions and potential breakout routes were killing zones swept by machine gun fire and artillery. Survival became a matter of luck, not will. Being in the right cellar when the bombardment came, choosing the right moment to run, encountering a Soviet unit willing to accept surrender rather than shoot on sight. In the basement of a shattered building near the Brandenburg Gate, SS Brigade Führer Gustav Krukenberg gathered what remained of his command. The exact words vary in survivor accounts, but the message was identical. Gentlemen, we are going to die here, but we will do so with honor. This wasn't a rallying cry for victory, it was a death announcement. By April 30th, 1945, the Nordland Division had been reduced to scattered pockets fighting street to street, their ammunition counted in single rounds rather than crates. The battle for the Reichstag became the division's final act. Survivors described combat stripped to its most primitive, fighting with one bullet at a time, scavenging magazines from fallen comrades, waiting in cellars for the brief darkness when they could attempt breakouts through Soviet lines. A Danish volunteer recalled the surreal calculus of survival. We counted our rounds, 5 left, 3, 1. Then it was bayonets and entrenching tools. The Panzerfausts that had been so effective at 60 meters against T-34 tanks were now useless. The fighting was too close, the streets too choked with rubble for anything but small arms and grenades. As Soviet forces closed on the Reichstag itself, some SS officers performed their final duties, burning regimental flags to prevent Soviet capture. These weren't military necessities. They were symbolic gestures. The last defiant acts of men who knew their cause was obliterated. The 23rd SS Panzergrenadier Regiment Norge and the 24th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment Denmark ceased to exist as organized units. Their standards, carried from the Eastern Front through years of retreat, were reduced to ash in steel drums while Soviet artillery pounded the streets above. The smoke from burning flags mixed with the smoke from burning buildings. Officers saluted as the fabric blackened and curled. Some wept. Others stood stone-faced. They were destroying the last physical evidence that their units had ever existed. Krukenberg himself led a small group in a nighttime breakout attempt on April 30th, personally guiding them through Soviet positions in a desperate bid to reach Western lines. It was an act that captured the final hours perfectly. A general reduced to squad leader, navigating by burning buildings, hoping for survival rather than victory. They moved through sewers, crawled through rubble, hid in basements when Soviet patrols passed. Some made it, most didn't. As the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag on April 30th, 1945, the destruction of the Nordland Division was nearly complete. What remained was not a military unit, but scattered survivors fleeing through the ruins. The mathematics of annihilation are stark and absolute. The 11th SS Nordland Division entered the Battle of Berlin with approximately 7,000 to 8,000 men. When the shooting stopped, only 300 to 500 survived to escape or surrender. A 90% casualty rate, one of the highest suffered by any military unit in World War II. This wasn't a tactical defeat. This was the systematic erasure of an entire military formation. The numbers tell the story that propaganda couldn't hide. Up to 90% of the division's personnel were killed, wounded, or captured in less than 2 weeks of fighting. Most survivors fell into Soviet hands during the final collapse. A minority managed to break through to Western lines, using the cover of darkness and burning buildings to navigate past Soviet positions. Those who made it carried stories of comrades who didn't. Men left bleeding in cellars, bodies abandoned in streets too dangerous to retrieve, entire squads vanishing during failed breakout attempts. Soviet sources report capturing thousands of Waffen-SS personnel in Berlin, though exact breakdowns by unit remain unclear due to the chaos of those final hours. The prisoners told interrogators of fighting with single rounds, of scavenging ammunition from fallen comrades, of tanks that became metal coffins when fuel ran out. Many bore wounds from the house-to-house fighting, burns from flamethrowers, shrapnel from artillery, injuries from hand-to-hand combat in rubble-choked rooms. But the destruction extended far beyond military casualties. In the sectors defended by the Nordland Division and the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, civilian casualties were catastrophic. Tens of thousands of Berlin's residents were killed or wounded during the fighting and bombardment. Soviet artillery made no distinction between military positions and apartment buildings. The same streets where foreign volunteers made their last stand became mass graves for German families who'd sought shelter in basements. Children died in those cellars. Mothers, grandparents, people who'd never held a weapon. They were crushed when buildings collapsed, burned when incendiaries hit, killed by shrapnel that tore through concrete walls. The Nordland Division had been erased from the order of battle. The foreign volunteers who'd marched east believing in Germanic unity were now statistics in Soviet after-action reports. Bodies counted, prisoners processed, equipment cataloged and scrapped. But the human cost extended far beyond military statistics, touching families across Europe who'd received letters or visits confirming what they'd already suspected, shaping post-war memory and national reckonings that would continue for decades. The war ended in May 1945, but for the foreign volunteers who survived Berlin, the real nightmare was just beginning. A Danish SS veteran stepped off a train in Copenhagen expecting relief, perhaps even a quiet homecoming after surviving the apocalypse. Instead, he was arrested within hours. Denmark had no sympathy for men who'd worn German uniforms. Neither did Norway, where returning Nordland volunteers faced immediate prosecution under collaboration laws. The Netherlands was equally unforgiving. The war's end brought no relief for foreign SS volunteers, only trials, imprisonment, and a social ostracism that would follow them for decades. The participation of foreign volunteers in the SS remains one of Europe's most controversial legacies, fueling debates on collaboration, resistance, and national memory that persist today. Post-war narratives in Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands grappled with this uncomfortable truth through legal proceedings and systematic stigmatization. Survivors faced treason charges, prison sentences ranging from months to life, permanent civil disabilities, loss of voting rights, professional licenses, even citizenship in extreme cases. Families were ostracized. Neighbors refused to speak to them. Children of SS volunteers grew up under the shadow of their fathers' choices, bearing surnames that marked them as collaborators' descendants. Some changed their names, others emigrated. Many carried the shame in silence. Gustav Krukenberg's post-war testimony, given during Allied interrogations and later documented in German archives, contributed to historical understanding of Berlin's final battle. But it also served as a warning against extremism and totalitarianism. His detailed accounts of the hopeless defense, the private doubts among officers, and the catastrophic casualties helped historians reconstruct the Wehrmacht's collapse. Other survivor accounts followed similar patterns, factual military narratives intertwined with justifications, regrets, and attempts to separate soldierly duty from ideological complicity. Some survivors claimed they'd only followed orders. Others insisted they'd fought against Bolshevism, not for Nazism. A few admitted they'd been wrong. Most said nothing at all. The destruction and suffering in Berlin influenced post-war reconstruction across Europe, shaping denazification programs and collective memory regarding World War II's end. The Nordland Division's annihilation became a cautionary tale in military academies studying urban warfare and the dangers of fanatical last stands. But beyond tactical lessons, Berlin's ruins testified to ideology's human cost. Foreign volunteers dying for a regime that abandoned them, civilians crushed between armies, a city reduced to rubble by orders that made no military sense. The Battle of Berlin and the Nordland Division's annihilation offer lessons that extend far beyond 1945, speaking to the dangers of fanaticism and the human cost of ideological warfare. Military academies still study the Battle of Berlin, not as a model to emulate, but as a warning of what happens when ideology overrides military reality. The Nordland Division's final stand has become a case study in the catastrophic intersection of fanaticism, urban warfare, and command collapse. When officers at West Point or Sandhurst analyze Berlin 1945, they're examining a textbook example of how not to conduct military operations, a cautionary tale written in the blood of 7,000 to 8,000 men who entered the battle and the mere 300 to 500 who survived. The lessons are uncomfortably relevant. Urban warfare specialists study how defenders with fewer than 10 operational tanks, ammunition restricted to a few dozen rounds per rifle, and no hope of resupply managed to delay a vastly superior force. The tactical innovations born of desperation, using immobilized armor as fortified positions, deploying Panzerfausts in close quarters combat, organizing ad hoc units from disparate forces, appear in modern military doctrine. But the strategic lesson is darker. Last stands without achievable objectives don't demonstrate courage. They demonstrate the failure of leadership. Berlin reveals patterns that repeat across history's desperate urban battles, like Stalingrad before it, like the Warsaw Uprising, like the defense of Budapest. Berlin combined house-to-house fighting, improvised defenses, catastrophic civilian casualties, and the dangerous variable of ideological commitment. Modern counterinsurgency experts recognize the same dynamics in Grozny, Fallujah, Aleppo, cities where determination cannot overcome impossible odds, where every block defended comes at exponential human cost. The humanitarian lesson cuts deepest. Gustav Krukenberg's post-war testimony, "I felt a profound responsibility for the lives of my men, but the circumstances left little choice," exposes the moral trap of fanatical orders. When ideology demands fighting to the last man regardless of military sense, the result isn't heroism, it's massacre. The tens of thousands of civilian casualties in the Nordland Division's defensive sectors, the wounded left without medical treatment, the city reduced to rubble by orders that served no strategic purpose. These are the consequences when humanitarian considerations vanish from warfare. Modern military ethics training uses Berlin as a case study. Officers study Krukenberg's dilemma. When do you refuse an order? When does duty become complicity? When does obedience become murder? There are no easy answers, but Berlin provides the questions. The ruins of Berlin in 1945 teach us that last stands are not heroic when the cause is lost. They are simply catastrophic. The Nordland Division's 90% casualty rate stands as testament to the ultimate cost of fanaticism. The Nordland Division's destruction was absolute, a 90% casualty rate that transformed foreign volunteers into ghosts in Berlin's ruins. Their final stand revealed not the triumph of ideology, but its catastrophic failure. Men fighting with single rounds for a regime that had already abandoned them. As Soviet flags rose over the Reichstag, the last organized SS formation dissolved into history. 7,000 to 8,000 men entered the battle. Only 300 to 500 walked away. The rest remain in Berlin's ruins, a cautionary tale of fanaticism's ultimate cost, written in blood and rubble, speaking across 80 years to warn us what happens when ideology demands death over reason, when orders override humanity, when the last stand becomes the last mistake. Their story is not heroic, it is necessary. We remember not to honor their cause, but to ensure we never repeat their catastrophe. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.